But the boy had not walked all the way out to the county road to walk home, with his hands empty. 40, he said. His voice did not shake, which surprised him. 50, Stroud answered before the auctioneer could even repeat the number, half turned now, so the crowd could enjoy his face. 60, said Isaiah. 70, said Stroud, and shook his head in mock wonder. Lord, would you look at him go? 80. It cost Isaiah something to get the word out, because it left him $5 between himself and empty, and the whole barn heard the small catch in it, and laughed the harder, the kind of laughter that has a little cruelty folded up inside it. The auctioneer looked to Stroud for the raise that would finish the boy off for good. 85, Isaiah said before Stroud could open his mouth. It was the number that emptied his pockets. It was 2 whole years of his life laid out loud in front of a barn full of people who thought his life was a joke. The word came out steady, and it landed, and for a moment there was nothing on the far side of it but Garrett Stroud's grin. Stroud let the silence stretch until he had every eye in the building. Then he spread his hands wide and laughed. You know what, he said. Keep it. Keep your boat anchored, boy. He turned back to his neighbors, shaking his head, washing his hands of the whole foolish thing, with a showman's flourish. I am not going to stand up here and rob a child of his life savings over a hunk of burned iron. Let him have his treasure. The laughter swelled, and it was worse than the bidding had been, because now the joke was finished, and Isaiah was standing alone in the middle of the punchline. Going once, the auctioneer managed, wiping his eyes. Going twice. Sold, to the young man, for $85. Isaiah walked to the front, and laid down his money, counted out bill by bill, onto the clerk's table, and when he was done there was nothing left rolled in the sock, and nothing left under the loose board at home. He counted it, without a word, and he did not let his hand shake while he did it. And when it was done he turned, and looked at the safe instead of at the crowd. Son, the auctioneer said, not unkindly, dropping his voice almost private, you understand we do not deliver. That thing is yours right where it sits. It has to go 380 pounds. I know, Isaiah said. It was the first thing he had said above a whisper, since he walked in. What happened next the town would talk about for a while, though not in the way Stroud had intended. The boy went and fetched the flatbed handcart he had left by the door, the kind a man uses to move feed sacks, and he wheeled it in, through the big doors. Then, alone, in front of a barn full of people, who had just finished laughing at him, Isaiah Booker set his shoulder against 380 pounds of warped steel, and began to move it. It did not go easily, and it did not go quick. He rocked it up onto a corner, and walked it inch by grinding inch, the way you move a thing that weighs more than you do, his whole body bent to the work. Nobody stepped up to help. A few men called out advice, that was really just more laughing wearing a hat. Stroud watched with his arms folded, and that same lazy certainty sitting on his face, enjoying the struggle nearly as much as he had enjoyed the bidding. And Isaiah let them watch. That was the part that unsettled a few of them later, when they thought back on it. The boy did not rush to get out from under their eyes. He did not flush, or curse or beg a hand. He worked the safe up onto the cart, and he lashed it down with a length of rope, and through the whole of it he wore a face that had no shame in it anywhere. Only a kind of quiet, terrible patience, as though he and the steel had an appointment that none of them had been invited to. He had bet $85 he could not spare against a box no man had opened in 16 years. The whole county had decided he would fail, and most of them had put their certainty into laughter and spent it free. They did not know about his ears. They did not know whose ears they had been before they were his. They only knew the price, the way Garrett Stroud only ever knew the price. Isaiah took up the handles, leaned into the weight, and started the long walk home, with his father's safe. The walk should have taken 20 minutes. It took him the better part of 2 hours, because 380 pounds does not roll, it crawls, and a feed cart complains under that kind of load, with every turn of its wheels. He kept to the shoulder of the county road, as the afternoon ran long, stopping every 50 yards to let his arms quit shaking, before he leaned in again. He was almost to the edge of town, where the county road became Bell Street, and the gravel gave over to cracked pavement, when he heard an engine slow behind him. It was a pickup, and he knew the 3 young men in it, before it even pulled even with him. They were the sons of Stroud's foreman, and the cousins of his hired hands, the kind of boys who grow up understanding that their last names come with permission. The one driving, a heavy-set boy named Wade Tolliver, leaned out with his elbow on the door, and coasted along at Isaiah's walking pace, so slow the engine bucked, and grumbled under him. "There he is," Wade called loud enough for the others to laugh. "The richest fool in Cade County." Isaiah did not look at them. He had already heard, that afternoon, the thing the town had decided to believe, and he heard it again now in the way Wade said it. The story had traveled faster than he had, the way an ugly story always does. A Booker boy with $85. Where does a boy like that come up, with $85? It was not really a question. It was an accusation wearing the shrug of one. By supper time it would be settled fact in half the kitchens in the county, that Isaiah must have stolen it, because the truth, that he had swept floors 2 years to save it, was nowhere near as satisfying. The truck nosed ahead, and swung onto the shoulder, angling across his path, so he had to stop. The 3 of them got out, taking their time, and stood in a loose half-circle around the cart. They did not put a hand on him. That was not quite the kind of thing they were. But Wade set one boot up on the lip of the cart, and shoved the safe, testing how it sat, and the whole load rocked hard enough that Isaiah had to throw his weight on the handles to keep it from going over into the ditch. "Careful," Isaiah said. It was the only word he gave them. "Careful," Wade repeated, grinning, and gave it another push, lighter, just to watch the boy scramble. "What you got in here anyway? Your daddy leave you something?" One of the others snorted. "Heard your daddy went into the thorn to clean the place out, and the Lord shut the lights off on him. That what you are after? Finishing the job he started." The words were meant to land somewhere soft, and they did. Isaiah felt them go in. But he had a great deal of practice at not showing where he had been hit, and he only held the cart steady, and waited, looking past the 3 of them to the place where the road bent toward home, until standing in the road taunting a boy who would not taunt back stopped being any kind of fun. After a while Wade took his boot off the cart, told Isaiah to enjoy his garbage, and the 3 of them climbed back in, and roared off toward town, leaving him in the settling dust. Isaiah stood a moment, breathing. Then he picked up the handles, and went on. By the time he had the safe up the outside stairs to his rented room above the hardware store, the light was nearly gone. The room was small, 1 window and a bed, and a table he had built himself out of crate wood, and the safe took up most of the floor, when he rocked it off the cart, and let it down, with a thud that shook dust from the boards. He stood over it in the dimness, this thing he had given 2 years, and every dollar he owned to hold, and for the first time, since the hammer fell he let himself feel how tired he was. Then he lit the oil lamp, because the room had no electric light he could afford to run, and he knelt down in front of his father's safe, and got to work. The dial was the first problem, and a bad one. The fire had not only blackened the brass, it had reached inside the mechanism the dial turned, and Isaiah understood the moment he laid his fingers on it, that the heat had done something cruel in there. A safe's combination works through a stack of little wheels, each one notched, and when the right numbers bring all those notches into a single line, a lever drops, and the bolt is free to slide. He had learned all of it in Roy's back room, taking the old practice locks apart again and again until the logic of them lived in his hands. But that logic assumed the wheels could turn clean. When he put his ear to the door and worked the dial, what he heard was not the small clean music a good lock makes. It was a grinding, a dragging, the sound of metal that had melted just slightly, and then cooled into a shape it was never meant to hold. The spindle, the center post the dial rides on, had warped. Not much. A fraction of an inch, a craftsman's worth of nothing. But a lock is a thing of fractions, and that warp meant every wheel inside was dragging against its neighbor, all of them fighting him at once. He could have forced it. A man with a torch, and no patience, and no care for what was inside could have cut that safe open in an afternoon, the way the county had likely been tempted to a dozen times, over 16 years. But Isaiah had not paid $85 to destroy the thing his father had died beside. He wanted it open and whole. And so the only tool he had for the job was the one he had been born with and could not buy, or borrow, the patience to listen to a mechanism that did not want to talk. He settled in. The hours went strange, the way they do for a person alone, with one task in the middle of the night. Outside, Bell Street emptied. The hardware store below him went dark. The last truck rattled past sometime before midnight, and after that there was nothing but the small hiss of the oil lamp, and the boy's own breathing, and the steady careful click of the dial under his fingers. He worked the first wheel, feeling for the place where its drag changed, where the notch wanted to sit, and it took him longer than it ever had on any of Roy's practice locks, because the warp lied to him. It threw false catches, made every wheel feel like the right one, until he tested it, and the lever stayed up. His hands began to give out, before his patience did. The dial was small, and the fire had pitted its edge, and turning it 1,000 times, 10,000 times, with the firm steady pressure the work asked for, wore the skin of his fingers raw. A blister rose at the base of his thumb, and broke, and the brass went slick under it, and he wiped his hand on his trousers, and kept on. There was nobody to see him do it, and nobody to see what it cost him, and somewhere in those small hours, that fact stopped being lonely, and turned almost holy. It was just him, and the steel, and the thing his father had left inside it. He thought about Nathaniel Booker more in those hours than he had in his whole life. He had no memories of the man, only the soft photograph, and the cruel story, and into that empty place he had always been careful not to pour too much hope, because hope is a thing that can be taken from you, and he had learned young to keep it small. But kneeling there, with his ear against the warm metal, he let himself wonder. Roy's unfinished sentences came back to him, the way the old man would say you are not the first Booker, with those ears, and then go quiet, and reach for his cup. Isaiah had always taken it for the loose talk of a man who had drunk too much. Now, in the dark, with his father's safe under his bleeding hands, it sounded like the edge of an answer. The first wheel found its line a little after midnight. He felt it more than heard it, a softening, a place where the dragging eased, and the wheel sat down, where it wanted to be, and he held his breath, and turned slow the other way to bring up the second. The second was worse. The warp deepened, as the wheels stacked, and the second one fought him for the better part of an hour, throwing false catch after false catch, each one lifting his hope, and dropping it again. His knees ached against the floorboards. The oil in the lamp burned low, and he trimmed the wick, and went on. But it came, eventually. A little after 1 in the morning he felt the second notch line up behind the first, and now there was only one wheel left between Isaiah Booker and whatever 16 years had been keeping from him. And the last wheel would not move at all. This was the thing he had been afraid of, since he first put his ear to the door, and heard the grinding. The fire had done its worst at the back of the stack, nearest the door's outer face, where the steel was thinnest, and the heat had run hottest. The third wheel had not just warped. It had fused, very slightly, to the post it rode on, welded by the fire, into one seized piece, and no amount of careful turning would bring its notch around to the line, because it would not turn. It simply would not turn. Isaiah sat back on his heels in the failing light, and for the first time all night the patience went out of him. It went all at once, the way air leaves a thing that has been holding it too long. He looked at his hands, at the broken blisters, and the brass dust ground into the creases of his knuckles, and he looked at the safe that had cost him 2 years, and every dollar he owned, and he understood, with a terrible clearness, that he might have just thrown away everything he had in the world for a box he could not open. The county had bet that he would fail. Garrett Stroud had laughed, and let him have his treasure precisely, because Stroud was certain it was no treasure at all, and every soul in that barn had agreed with him. And maybe they were right. Maybe the boat anchor was only a boat anchor. Maybe the story was only the story, and his father had been only a thief the Lord had judged, and Isaiah was only a fool kneeling in the dark over a dead man's locked box, proving every laughing mouth in Cade County correct. He felt the sting come up behind his eyes, and he let it, because there was no one to see. He bent forward, and put his forehead against the cold steel of the door, and he wept quietly, the way a person weeps, when weeping is the only thing left to do. And it was the lowest he had been in a long life of low places. And it was there, with his head against the metal, and his hands gone still, that he remembered the rest of the sentence. It was not Roy's voice. He understood that even, as it came to him. It was a thing Roy had said, but Roy had been quoting somebody, the way the old man quoted that one line every time he had drunk enough whiskey to turn honest and sad. Your daddy used to say you do not open a lock. You let it open. You quit fighting the thing, and you let it tell you where it wants to go. Isaiah had heard it 100 times, and dismissed it 100 times, as a drinking man's poetry. But he was not fighting a clean lock. He was fighting a wounded one. And you do not wrestle a wounded thing. You do not force a wheel the fire has already broken. You listen for what it can still do, and you ask it for only that. He lifted his head. He wiped his face with the back of his ruined hand, and he stopped trying to turn the third wheel. Instead he went back to the spindle itself, the warp center post, and he laid 2 fingers on the dial, so light he was hardly touching it at all, and he shut his eyes, and he let everything in his body go slack, the way you do when you mean to feel something very small. He was not turning the lock now. He was reading it. And what he read, with his fingertips, and the side of his face against the steel, was that the seized wheel was not seized the whole way. It had perhaps a hair of play in it, the width of a held breath, before the fused metal stopped it cold. Not enough to bring the notch to the line by turning. But maybe, just maybe enough, if he eased the spindle the other way at the same instant, if he relieved the drag of the warp by a fraction, while he coaxed that last hair of movement out of the wheel, that would not move. It was not a thing he could have explained to anyone. It was not a thing he had been taught. It came up out of him, from a place he had not known was in him, the same place, he would think later, that his father's hands had once worked from, and he let it lead him. He eased the dial back, with one hand, and pressed the lightest pressure on the spindle, with the other, and he held his whole self still, and he asked the broken thing for the one small movement it still had left to give. At 2 in the morning, the last wheel gave it up. The notch came around the final hair of its travel, and dropped into the line, and Isaiah heard it, clean and clear, and impossibly sweet, after all those hours of grinding, one bright sound in the dark room. Click. For a moment he did not move, afraid he had dreamed it. Then he took hold of the handle, the warped corner, that had pulled away from the frame, and he drew it, and the bolt slid back, and the door of his father's safe swung open for the first time in 16 years. What was inside did not come to him all at once, and that was a mercy, because all at once might have been more than a tired boy could hold. The first thing was the money. It sat in the bottom in neat banded stacks, the kind of cash that does not get spent, so much as kept, and beside it a folded sheaf of bonds, the bearer kind, worth their face to whoever holds them, and a small velvet roll, with a few good pieces of jewelry. Isaiah touched it, and drew his hand back, as if it were hot. It was a great deal of money, more than he had ever seen, more than he had words for, and his first feeling, kneeling over it in the lamplight, was not joy. It was confusion, sharp and turning. This was not a stripped hotel safe. This was not the soot and disappointment the auctioneer had promised. Why would a man let a fortune like this burn? Why had it sat untouched in a county shed for 16 years, while the whole town swore there was nothing in it worth the haul? The second thing answered the first. Tucked up against the side of the safe, set where it would be found, was an envelope, its edges browned by the fire, but not eaten through, and across the front of it, in a careful hand, was written to be opened in the event of my death. Isaiah opened it, with fingers that had stopped feeling their own pain. Inside was a single letter in that same careful hand, signed at the bottom by Edmund Thorne, the man who had owned the hotel, the man who had also died the night it burned. Isaiah read it once fast, and once slow, and the second reading changed the shape of the world. The letter did just one thing, but it did it completely. It said that Edmund Thorne, having no family left, and no love at all for the man who ran Cade County, had decided what was to become of everything he owned. He had put it in writing, and he had locked it in this safe, so that no man could alter it before the law could read it. His hotel, his land, his money, all of it was to go to the town itself, to be held in trust for the building of a library, and a place of learning, that any child in the county might use, regardless, the letter said, of who their people were. He had named the men he did not trust to carry out his wishes, and he had named them plainly, and he had written that he expected they would try to bury the document the moment they got their hands on it, and that he was locking it away for exactly that reason, so they could not. Isaiah sat with the letter, and the money no longer looked like money. It looked like evidence. But the letter was not the last thing in the safe, and the last thing was not for the town, or the law. It was small, and it had slid down beside the bonds, where a hurried hand might have missed it, and Isaiah's fingers found it, when he reached in to be sure he had taken everything. It was a roll of dark cloth, soft with age, and when he opened it across his knee in the lamplight he was looking at a locksmith's tools. Picks and tension wrenches, and a small brass-handled driver. A working man's kit, well used, the handles worn to the shape of a hand, that was not Isaiah's. And on the brass handle of the driver, scratched in by the point of a knife, the way a man marks a tool, so it will find its way home to him, were two letters. N.B. Isaiah did not need anybody to tell him, and that was the cruelty, and the gift of it both, that no letter explained this part, that there was no voice to hand him the answer, and let him doubt it. He was a locksmith. He knew a locksmith's hands by the wear they left, and he was holding the tools of a man who had worked them, until the brass remembered his grip, and the man's initials were cut into the handle, and the man's last name was his own. And slowly, in the failing lamplight, he understood why those tools were on the inside of a safe instead of out in the world, where a working man keeps them. Edmund Thorne had needed someone he could trust to set the combination on this safe, and lock his letter away, where his enemies could not reach it. And in all of Cade County, the man he trusted was a black locksmith, with gifted hands. Nathaniel Booker had done the work the way Isaiah now knew he did everything, with care. And he had left his own tools inside, as the last thing, before he closed the door, not by accident, but the way a man leaves his mark on a thing he wants known later. A locksmith's signature. Proof, for whoever finally opened it, of exactly whose hands had been trusted with the secret. And then the fire had come, fast, and from somewhere it had no honest reason to start, and Nathaniel had gone back into the burning hotel for the one thing a man like him would risk his life for. Not gold. Not bonds. The truth he had just sealed away. And the fire had taken him, before he could carry it back out. The story the town had told for 16 years was not only unkind, it was a lie, and it was a lie that had been told on purpose, by the very man Edmund Thorne had named in his letter, to bury a will that would have changed, who got to learn, and who got to grow rich in Cade County. They had let a good man be remembered, as a thief, because a thief made a tidier story than a witness. And the proof of all of it had been sitting inside a box that no one could open, waiting 16 years for the one person in the world, with the right hands, and the right reason to open it. Isaiah closed his fingers around his father's tools. The lamp had nearly burned out, and the window had begun to go gray at its edge, and somewhere past the rooftops the town, that had laughed at him the day before, was beginning to wake. He did not feel like weeping anymore. He felt very clear, and very steady, and very much, for the first time in his life, like his father's son. Isaiah did not sleep. He sat with his father's tools in his lap, until the gray in the window turned to gold. Then he washed his ruined hands, as best he could, wrapped the letter, and the bonds, and the tools in the same dark cloth, put the money in the canvas feed sack he had used the day before, carried it all down the outside stairs, and started up Bell Street toward the county courthouse. The same road he had dragged the safe down the evening before, only now he carried what had been inside it. Word of the auction had gone far enough that there were people about who knew his face, and they watched him pass, this boy they had laughed at, walking up the middle of the street, with a feed sack over his shoulder, and a look that made a few of them go quiet, without knowing why. By the time he reached the courthouse square, a small crowd had gathered in his wake, drawn by the plain strangeness of it, half of them expecting, he supposed, to watch the Booker boy make a fool of himself one more time. Garrett Stroud's silver Cadillac was parked across two spaces in front of the courthouse, and Stroud himself was up on the steps holding court, with two of the county commissioners, and he turned, when he heard the murmur of the crowd, and saw Isaiah coming. "Well," Stroud called out, loud, for the benefit of the men beside him, and the people gathering below. "If it is not the richest fool in Cade County. You get your boat anchor open, boy. You bring us a bucket of suit." The crowd laughed, but it was a thinner laugh than the day before, because something in the way the boy walked had taken the certainty out of it. Isaiah went up the courthouse steps, until he stood level with the commissioners, and he set the feed sack down, and he opened the dark cloth on the wide stone rail, where everyone could see. And he did not say a single word at first. He simply laid out, one piece at a time, what the fire had failed to destroy. The banded cash. The folded bonds. The brown envelope, with Edmund Thorne's careful hand across the front. And last of all, set apart from the rest, the worn locksmith's tools, with the initials scratched into the brass. The square had gone very quiet by the time he straightened up. "Mr. Thorne left a letter," Isaiah said, and his voice carried in the stillness better than any shout could have. "He wrote it himself, and he signed it, and he locked it in his safe, so the men he did not trust could not get rid of it, before the law could read it. He left everything he had to this town. To a library, and a school, for any child in this county, no matter who their people were." He looked at the two commissioners, as he said it, and one of them had gone the color of paper. He named the man he figured would try to bury it. "I expect the law will want to read those names for itself." He set his hand on the worn tools. "And these belong to the man Mr. Thorne trusted to lock that letter away. The man who went into that hotel the night it burned, trying to carry the truth back out. For 16 years this town has said Nathaniel Booker went into the Thorne to steal. He did not. He went in because a man needed a lock kept honest, and he was the one folks trusted to do it. He was my father. And he died in their keeping a promise that some of the people standing in this square made sure nobody ever found out about." No one laughed now. No one said anything at all. It was Roy who broke the silence. The old locksmith had come out from his shop on Bell Street with the rest of the town, and he had been standing at the edge of the crowd, and he came forward now, through the people, slow, an old man's walk, until he reached the foot of the steps. He looked up at Isaiah, and then he turned, and looked at the commissioners, and at Garrett Stroud, and whatever he had been carrying for 16 years, he set it down at last. "The boy is telling it true," Roy said. His voice was rough, and it was not loud, but the square was so quiet it did not need to be. "Nate Booker worked beside me 9 years. There was not an honester man in this county, and there was not a better set of hands. Edmund Thorne came to me, when he wanted that letter locked away, where these gentlemen could not reach it, and I sent him to Nate, because Nate was the one I trusted, and Nate was the one who could do it, so it stayed done." He looked at Isaiah, and something gave way in the old face that had been shut tight for 16 years. "I knew," he said. "I knew what they said about him was a lie. And I held my tongue, because I was afraid of these same men, and I have been ashamed of it every day since. I should have told you, son. I am sorry I let you grow up hearing it." The thing the town had believed for 16 years came apart right there in the square, in the space of two men speaking, and there was no putting it back together. What happened to Garrett Stroud happened slower than the laughter had, but it was sure. The letter and the names in it went, where Isaiah said they would go, to the law, and the law in those years was not always quick to listen to a black boy in a southern town. But a signed will in a dead man's hand, locked in his own safe, naming the very man who had spent 16 years growing rich off land that should have gone to a library, was not a thing that could be laughed away. It came out, over the months that followed, that Stroud had bought the Thorne land and the hotel ground for almost nothing in the confusion, after the fire, had bought it from a county that had no right to sell it, because Edmund Thorne had already given it away in a letter those same officials had pretended did not exist. The fortune Garrett Stroud had built on Bell Street had its first stone laid on a buried will and a slandered dead man. He fought it the way such men fight, with lawyers and bluster, and a great deal of noise about his good name. But the names in Edmund Thorne's hand could not be unsaid, and the worn tools, with the scratched initials, could not be unseen, and one by one the people of Cade County, who had been afraid of Garrett Stroud for 30 years, discovered they were not afraid of him anymore. The long Cadillac went, sold to cover what the courts said he owed. The storefronts went. By the time the trust was settled, and the land turned back to the purpose Edmund Thorne had set for it, Garrett Stroud had nothing left in Cade County but a name that nobody would say kindly, and he left it the way such men leave, quietly, in the early part of a day, with no crowd to see him off. The last anyone saw of him, he had stopped his loaded car at the corner of Bell Street, and Isaiah happened to be standing in the doorway of the locksmith's shop, and for a moment the two of them looked at each other across a distance that had once been the whole weight of Cade County, and was now only the width of a street. Stroud's mouth worked, as though he meant to say something, some last cut, some final word to put the boy back in his place. But there was no word that fit anymore. The one thing he had counted on his whole life, the certainty that he could read the true price of a thing by the look of it, had failed him completely the single time it mattered, and he knew it, and the boy knew it, and there was nothing to say. Stroud looked away first. He drove on, and he did not come back. The town did its reckoning the way towns do, unevenly and incompletely, but it did it. The people who had laughed loudest in the barn were the quietest now, and some of them found their way to the locksmith's shop in the weeks that followed to say a thing or two to Isaiah they should have said years before, and he received them with the same steady patience he had shown the steel, which is to say, without bitterness, and without quite forgetting either. Edmund Thorne's wish was carried out at last. The money built what he had asked to be built, and over the door of it, by a vote that surprised nobody, the town put a name. Not Thorne's. Thorne had asked for a library and a school, not a monument to himself. The name they put over the door was Booker, for the man who had carried a secret into a fire and let the town call him a thief for 16 years rather than break a promise. The Nathaniel Booker Library and Learning Center, where any child in the county could go, no matter who their people were, exactly as the letter had asked. There was a great deal of money the court said was his by right, the share Edmund Thorne's letter had set aside for the family of the man who kept his trust. Isaiah did not pretend he was too proud to take it. A man does not honor his father by refusing what his father died to leave behind, and so he took that share, and he was not ashamed of it. But the rest, the hotel and the land, and the fortune, that had never been any one man's to keep, he let go, where the letter had always meant it to go, into the building. With his own share he did 3 quiet things. He put a proper headstone on the grave, that had gone 16 years unmarked, because the town had buried his father, as a thief. He bought the little shop on Bell Street, from Roy outright, so that no man in Cade County could ever again tell a booker what he was, and was not allowed to build. And the rest he set aside, untouched, the way his father had once set aside good wood, against whatever his own children might one day need. He kept 3 things besides. He kept the auctioneer's receipt for $85, folded small in his shirt pocket, because a man ought to remember what he had, when he started, and what he was willing to spend all of it on. He kept his father's tools, which he cleaned, and oiled and laid in the drawer of his own bench, beside his own. And he kept the safe. It stood now in the front hall of the new library, the ugly fire-blackened safe, that no man had been able to open in 16 years, its warped door standing open the way Isaiah had left it, that night, and beside it a small brass plate told the part of the story, that could be told in a few words. Children walked past it every day on their way to the books, and most of them did not know the whole of it, and that was all right. The safe stood open, and that was the thing it was there to say. Isaiah went back to the locksmith trade. He worked beside Roy until the old man could not work any more, and then he worked the shop alone, the only locksmith in Cade County, with hands that the years slowly filled in, with the same gray graphite that had stained his father's. Sometimes, walking home up Bell Street in the evening, he would pass the library, and see the open safe through the lit front window, and he would slow and look at it a moment, from across the street, and let himself feel the quiet, steady pride of a thing well done, and a name set right. Then he would go on home. Here is the thing worth carrying out of this one. When a crowd laughs at a person for valuing something that looks like nothing at all, you have a choice to make about who you are going to be. You can spend your certainty cheap, the way easy laughter spends it, and add your voice to the noise. Or you can have the decency and the patience to stand still and wait, and let that person show you what they see. Because the price a room shouts at a thing has never once been the same as the truth of it, and the loudest voice in the barn is almost never the one that has actually looked. This story is a work of fiction. Every event, character, conversation, company, institution, and situation in this narrative is entirely imaginary, created for storytelling, and to explore dignity, fairness, courage, and the human cost of prejudice. Nothing here represents actual events, or should be read as fact. If this story moved you, subscribe, share it with one person who has ever been written off before they got the chance to speak, and tell me in the comments about someone in your life who was laughed at and turned out to be right all along.